Okay, I've been wrote a little article a while ago for the newsletter about recognizing the skill and competence that I've seen in club members as far as being able to restore and just bikes and just good mechanical knowledge. So I certainly like to wanted to create a forum where we could really pass that on, and for myself, kind of for selfish reasons, I just like to learn that, and so a tech night is what I have sort of talked and promoted. And just before I get into the actual tech topic tonight, I just wanted to point out a couple things I was hoping to get out of it. So goals of a tech night, or again, tech forum, would be to share knowledge of club members, support members attempting to service or restore their bikes. There's been a couple good examples in the last month or so that I've seen here, and that's been really nice. I guess the ultimate goal is get more bikes on the road. There's a lot of bikes that are sitting, waiting, and I'd certainly like to see more on the road. And as I'm getting more time, working a little bit less, I'm hoping to get more of my bikes out on the road. Document members' advice and experience. Recognizing engineering of past eras. I find that fascinating to see how some things can be very, very simple engineering, but very sort of competent. So technology is great, but I just get a kick out of pulling apart old things and seeing how they work. In the same respect, I'm not an engineer by trade or a mechanic by trade. When I do work on things, engineers are not always described well in my garage if I'm working on something. So I like to re-engineer things that I think may not have been good to begin with. And also, I think just promote a social aspect of club members and getting to know, pass on knowledge and have a good time sharing that. What I wanted to talk about tonight, or as a topic, is starting a neglected or long-time stored bike. So I've been doing this since I was relatively young, when I didn't have a lot of money or resources, and if there was a neglected bike, it was a good way to get a bike and to have something to ride. As my finances got better, I find myself a little bit bored with perfect running new bikes, and I like the challenge of finding something that looks like, can it still be saved and can we get it running? So the actual topic is starting a neglected bike that's been stored or left for many years, meaning like 5, 10 years or more. An example is I had a great time last night riding up and down my front street on a 1979 Yamaha XS11 Special that had been neglected and stored away, not stored well for about 10 years or more. And so I've brought it back to life and had a real gas just riding up and down the front street, going through the gears, making sure everything's fine. So just for an example, I bought this bike as advertised as a mechanic special back in August of 2014. Was not running for about 10 to 12 years. The bike was not stored well. It appeared to be complete. Came with an old Vetter fairing and sissy bar and rack and all the things of that kind of 70s era. I was given a box of accessories that included the original headlight bucket and screws and things like that. I bought it, what turned out to be from the original owner, who ended up giving me a lot of the original documentation of it. Just for fun, I found the original purchase price of that bike in 1979 was $4,790. So for back then, that was a pretty high price for a bike. But it was an extremely fast production bike. The 79 XS 1100 was one of the fastest production bikes put out that year. It was an 11-second bike in the quarter-mile stock, so had a lot of power to it. I was given a TOD and a climber manual, and I purchased it extremely cheap. Luckily, the owner was quite generous to me, and I loaded it up on the trailer and took it home. So to get it running, I went through a few. I came up with as many points as I could as I went through the bike and kind of remembered what I did with it. Before I Googled, because I wanted to see what I had compared to Googling. I work in healthcare, and we always call Google Dr. Google, because everyone always kind of looks up their symptoms and problems. And so I tried to stay away from a Google search and just come up with something. When I did a Google search after I put my points down, I didn't find something quite as comprehensive. There seemed to be a lot of topics of if you haven't stored your bike well for a year, then it won't start after winter storage and that sort of thing. But there's very few articles or blogs talking about really what do you do with that bike that's been sitting for a long time. So my kind of main points, and a lot of these are general things. I don't want to get into too much. I don't want to bore you too long, but we can probably get some tech topics out of each of these broad topics that I talk about. But the first one was, if you get a bike, buy a manual or borrow a manual. Get a hold of a manual, because there's a lot of even if you want to check what's the compression like in that bike, those sort of things, just for reference. What are the ranges, so you know kind of what you're working with. This is a very, again, basic, easy thing, but I think we overlook this sometimes. Do a very close visual inspection, because when you buy a bike, you're dealing with the owner and those sort of things, so you may miss some details. So as far as doing that inspection, look for missing parts, look for broken parts, look for any leaks, again, clues that might tell you there's a problem somewhere you may have to look at. I put something here called tenants. Does anyone know what I'm talking about with that? Tenants? Did Mr. and Mrs. Mouse build a house in your box? That kind of thing. I think that's really extremely important to look for. Talk about that in a minute too. And look at the wiring. What's the wiring in general shape? Or again, has something been gnawing at it, that kind of thing. Look to see what the previous owners have done. I've had some pretty ugly wiring work, and that's probably my weakest point is wiring, but I still look at some things and go, it's just, I don't know how it's running or things like that. So, third thing, remove the air box and clean any debris out, because anything in that air box could go into the motor if you do end up starting it. And from a racing perspective, I've seen some really interesting things go through a motor. Again, even small pieces of debris you want to avoid from going through your valve train and things like that. So, protect debris that's sucked into the carb, valve train, or cylinders. Clean that out well. Put a new air cleaner in. I mean, you can try and run the bike without an air cleaner, but if you're planning on using the bike again, the air cleaner may have some effect on vacuum and other things that affect the carb. So I think it's worthwhile if you've decided you're going to save this bike. And again, I point out, these are bikes that you've already made a decision, yeah, this is worth, I think I can get this going. And so I think get an air cleaner and have your air box set up the way it should be. Check your vacuum lines and for, if they're in good condition and hooked up in the right places. The fourth point is the engine. Is it seized or is it free? So when I buy something, I tend to look at it. If someone says, do you want me to turn the motor over? I go, no, don't do anything to the motor. If you're going to restore it, generally we're going to take that motor apart anyways. And even so, I want to, I'll go through a couple points. There's things I want to do with the motor. I don't want you risking breaking valves or things like that if the motor's a little bit stuck or something. So I'll deal with that later. Is the motor seized or free? Should you start or kick it over? And I put a big no there. Just wait till you get it home. Remove spark plugs. Put oil in cylinders. Excuse me. Again, when I look through some blogs after, there's some interesting combinations of what people put in: penetrating fluid, ATF oil, things like that. But I just tend to put motor oil in it just to, before I start to turn the motor over. Turn the engine over by hand. A couple different ways you can do that, even if it's just put the bike on a stand, put it in gear, put it in the top gear, fourth, fifth gear, whatever. Just turn the back wheel a little bit just to, you know, see if you can move it over slowly. And I think it's worth investing in new plugs. I tend to like the 4-cylinder bikes, so that is a little bit expensive, but it's worth it because you want to check to see if all cylinders are firing, and you don't want to risk a bad plug and all the angst that comes with having to figure out if that's your problem later. Checking compression, that's another thing I think there's some variance on, but for the most part you can check it cold. Sometimes it's suggested to check it warm. Should you check the throttle open and that sort of thing? But again, just for simplicity, we won't get into those details right now. But check the compression, and again, look at what the manual recommends, and a lot of times it'll tell you how you should check that compression. Fuel, probably one of the most important parts. Remove that fuel tank if the bike has been sitting for a long time. Inspect the inside of the tank. With my 79 XS, I was happy. It was probably the cleanest looking tank I've seen inside, not a spot of rust, so that doesn't always happen, but nice when it does. Remove the old fuel. Don't even waste the time with it. Check the fuel lines. Always have some fuel line available, because inevitably if the bikes have been sitting for a long time, those fuel lines are hard and leaky, and throw new fuel lines and filters on. The drain cocks, again, you can take them apart, but as long as they're functioning well. But if the bike has been sitting without any gas in it, you can expect the first time you put fuel in it, it's likely going to leak until those gaskets swell and that sort of thing again. So make sure I always have some cardboard on the floor of anything I'm working on in the shop, because you're bound to get some leaks, and sometimes they kind of correct themselves, so you don't need to get too carried away to begin with. Just let things sit for a little bit, and they may those gaskets may swell back up again. And new fuel. Always use new fuel. That's your best chance to get the bike running again. Carburetors, again, if the bike has been sitting for a long time, take them off and clean them. No sense trying to run anything through them. Inevitably, if that bike has been sitting with fuel in it, there's gummed up fuel in the jets and everything, and take them apart. That's why I knocked out a jet from one of the old carbs I had, because best to take that all apart and clean every small little hole, and that will, again, save you some figuring out why it's bogging down or issues like that. Confirm or adjust the float heights. Again, another important thing. So you know, once you put those carbs back together, I don't like to go back at them again to just figure out if I have everything correct. So while they're apart, make sure you've checked those sort of things. Lubrication. I tend to be, you know, I think I like to invest in some oil and change the oil at the time before I'm going to run it and things like that. So make sure that the levels are up, but again, I like to change that oil, because as it's been sitting for a long time, or if it's low, I don't want to run that motor or risk any kind of lack of oiling problems. Battery, you know, should you just take an old car battery and start it, that sort of thing. But again, I tend to have usually at least a spare motorcycle battery around that you can hook up, even if you want to check it. So I don't like to run too much power or set up too many batteries to try and get a lot of power out of it, especially when you're dealing with some of the transistorized CDI boxes and things like that. You don't want to risk those electronics. So just a regular strong motorcycle battery to start it. Check your stator. Check all the wiring connections and grounds. As I said, I'm not a great wiring guy, but again, it's worth taking the time to make sure your grounds are clean, and again, just your general, all your little plug-ins and everything is grounded properly. And check the fuse box and fuses, of course. The last thing I inspect the cables and lubricate them. This 79 XS I had, everything looked pretty good. But when I took the carbs off and looked at the throttle cable, it was frayed. It would still work and everything, but again, that's something you don't want to deal with later. So I knew right away that I had to order a new throttle cable, and so just as part of an inspection when you're taking that apart, that's good. So that would be everything that I tend to do, and again, I don't profess to be an expert. Anyone else who wants to sort of jump in, I'm going to put this, if we can put this in the newsletter or something like that, I'll kind of share the list that I did, and if anyone has anything to add, by all means we could add to that, because I know I probably am not totally comprehensive with that. Last thing I just wanted to mention is before a test ride, I heard something tonight, this kind of happens. I'm a little, I think from racing and prepping race cars and that, you tend to be really over, and I was taught by a really old mechanic to really check everything and check it twice, and so I still tend to do that. Inspect the brakes, replace the brake fluid, again, for as much as it, motorcycles don't hold a lot of brake fluid, change the brake fluid. In fact, I take the calipers off, check the seals. I had a couple stuck calipers on this bike, and again, it was worth taking it apart. I didn't have to buy any new seals, but the seals were really tight and had some gummed up brake fluid behind them, but once I moved everything apart and cleaned it out and put everything back in, the calipers worked really well. So again, worth the time to look at that sort of thing, because if you're stopping at the end of the back lane or something, or taking the liberty of riding a new bike down the road, I want to make sure I'm not running it into the back of the neighbor's car or something that's parked on the road. So, and of course, brake pads and leaks. Inspect the clutch, remove the wheels, and inspect the bearings. I like to just lubricate the axles. And something else I've kind of learned from racing, and do this whether it's with my touring Harley or something every year, torque all critical fasteners. I think we all need to do that to bikes, whether that's like swing arm bolts or things like that. You don't know who's been working on the bike before, and you don't need to find surprises. I think I ride pretty good and can react to some things, but if your bike is falling apart because something was not fastened right, you don't know. This is a new bike to use, so torque all critical fasteners, I think, is important. And for my bikes, I tend to have, if a list has been made, I know from our Harley there's a nice list of critical fasteners and a torque wrench, and well worth the effort. So I'm going to end it there. Hopefully that is helpful, and I'll post that on. And I'm always happy if someone wants to start a bike that's been sitting for a long time. I'm happy to give a little advice. Again, I'm probably not the best at it, but I'll share just because I kind of like to do that. And have, as a friend of mine said once, he says, I may not know everything, but I've blown up everything and broken it, so I know usually what not to do. But so anyways, hopefully we can help share that again. So I'll leave it at that, and thanks for listening.